John Gardner is the Shadow Education Minister for South Australia, the former minister as well, John, and you would have looked at this topic of mobile phones as we go back to the school year. You would have dealt with this policy issue a lot in office. Just generally, what has been the policy while you're in government for that 3 years?
Yeah, so look, obviously mobile phones have increasingly become a challenge for school in recent years. Through 2019 and 2020, we reviewed this very deeply. We looked at interstate best evidence and we spoke to all of the stakeholders and experts in the area at great length. We settled on a policy which we implemented in government where mobile phones were banned from primary schools. High schools were a bit more complex. There was more challenges with parents and students engaging with each other, and indeed some schools where mobile phones use was part of the curriculum. So we put in place a policy where all schools would have to proactively go to their communities, go to their students and their families and teachers and work on what would be the best policy for that school that they could have a shared input into. Schools would have to look at reducing the use of mobile phones, certainly, but they could tailor a response that was suitable for their school. So for the last 3 years, the Labor Party, in opposition and in government, have been beating their chests and talking a really tough game about having a full ban on mobile phones in all schools, in high schools in particular, where we hadn't instituted a full ban before. And over the last 6 months, when we've seen really challenging and difficult issues and incidents in schools of bullying or violence where they've been filmed, we've seen from Peter Malinauskas and the Labor government, their response has been, well, next year we'll have our ban in place. This week, the government has issued their policy to all schools, and it really doesn't stack up to what was promised. It doesn't include any money for schools to implement lockers or pouches to look after the phones. It just leaves schools to work on their own to devise a policy for their school. Pretty much what we did a few years ago, except without the raised expectation that it would be called a ban. And the document has so many exemptions in it, so many exceptions and exemptions that it really can't be construed, in my view, as a ban. It doesn't ban phones from schools. It doesn't even ban phones from a classroom. And it doesn't provide any support for teachers or principals or schools, no financial support for them to implement policies to reduce phone use. So we're really disappointed.
Yeah, and disappointed, I gather, though, in the sense that it's just Labor failing to deliver on what they promised, but it's not a policy position the Liberal Party has to ban phones in all schools. Is that right?
Well, we weren't the ones saying for the last 3 years, in a very macho way, that we would take this hardline step. We looked deeply into it. We found that it was a very complex issue. We massively tightened what was expected in terms of phones use in schools. But we didn't think that it was fair to characterise that as a ban, as it's not really a ban. Now, what Labor's done since coming to government, they've repeated a lot of the same work. They've spoken to stakeholders and experts. They've discovered it's complex. They've created 100 exemptions, but they're still calling it a ban. I mean, it's not bad that they've decided that they've worked out that it's complex and there need to be exemptions. It's just embarrassing for them that they insist on calling it a ban when it's not.
Well, amongst these exemptions, I gather one of these seems to be about potentially if a student needs to use their phone for wellness purposes. We know some of the smarter and older kids are good at finding an exemption if they need to use one. We're going to see confrontations between students and teachers saying, well, I need to be listening to my music on Spotify because it's for my wellness.
For their well-being, yeah. Look, this is one line in the policy that I was pretty surprised to see, to be honest, because in some ways it actually makes things a bit more easygoing, a bit more slapdash than they've been in the past. Look, in fairness, it's a line in the policy that says there's the ability for teachers, optional, to provide exemptions to individual students for their well-being or their employment, for example, if appropriate. But to be honest, the teachers that I've spoken to who've welcomed the idea of a full ban, one of the things they were really looking for was something they could point to tell the students, look, this is a policy around South Australia. It's not on to have your phone out, and, there's nothing I can do about it. The fact that the government has written into their policy that there are optional exemptions that teachers can grant, that's not going to make any teachers' lives easier.
Well, if anything, they're going to be lent upon by students, aren't they, to just, come on, Mrs. So-and-so, can you let us listen to our phones? It's boring in here.
Well, you can always hope that the student in question doesn't get a hold of the government policy document, but that doesn't make for a very strong policy document, does it? Hey, one of the giveaways that this is a challenge is that despite the fact that this is all about allegedly banning mobile phones in schools, and the government and Peter Malinauskas, whenever he's talked about it, he said, we're going to ban mobile phones in schools. The actual policy itself isn't called a ban. It doesn't use the word ban at all. The word ban appears once in the entire document. It's on the last page where it talks about, when this document was revised, when it was produced. And it says this document was produced basically to deliver on the government's ban on mobile phone policy. That is the only reference to the word ban in the entire document. Now, look, as I say, is it wrong that these exemptions are in place in some cases? Is it true that this is a complex area? Absolutely. But, I wasn't the one, and the Liberal Party weren't the ones who spent the last 3 years trying to drum up votes, being hairy-chested and macho about how tough we were going to be. The Labor Party, Peter Malinauskas, spent 3 years being very macho about this, but when it comes to delivery, his policy in some ways is much weaker than what was there before.
Well, John Gardner, Shadow Minister for Education, we have reached out to the Minister Blair Boyer's office for an explanation of just how the policy works and how much of a ban it actually is. We'll see what we find out on that front. Thanks for joining us as school heads back in 2023.
And best wishes to all of the students who are among your listeners and to the parents who are listening to your show. Monday, the kids are back at school, so hopefully happy days.